I'm Superintendent David Brown of Chicago Police Department, and I'm here with Chief of Detectives Brendan Deenihan. Hello, Brendan.
Soup, how you doing?
I'm well. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself, how long you've been on the department, how long you've been a detective?
Sure, Soup. So Brendan Deenihan, Chief of Detectives. I'm into my 24th year on the police department, and I've spent majority of my career in the detective division. I've been fortunate enough to be a homicide detective, and I work as a sergeant of detectives, homicide lieutenant, as well as a commander in the detective division, and then deputy chief and chief of detectives now.
So let me just go right into 2020. It's been a year like no other, and you've been a detective a long time. You've never been a detective in a global pandemic, nor have you experienced the civil unrest that we've had. It's unprecedented, and the impact on violence with everything else we're dealing with, its impact on the courts, slow to a crawl, really, because we haven't been able to convene trials. Grand juries have slowed. Courts are working remotely. Jail populations have shrunk to a bare minimum because of COVID's impact, and the electronic monitoring system here puts violent offenders on electronic monitors and release them back into the community with not the capacity to supervise them. So all of that impacts violence. What kind of year has it been for the typical homicide detective?
Well, for the typical homicide detective, it's been an extremely busy year just because of all the facts that you just mentioned. As you stated, the homicides have increased dramatically in Chicago, but not just Chicago, across the country because of the pandemic and because of the civil unrest. So for the Chicago detectives, as well as for, I'm assuming, other detectives across the country, it's just been an extremely challenging year with murder skyrocketing. And then, as you mentioned, with the court system coming to a crawl, detectives, obviously, as well as police officers, are probably the one system that they have to come to work every day and work through the pandemic. So it's just been really challenging altogether, on top of all the other challenges detectives face when they are working these murder cases.
And I want to humanize this a little bit more for the homicide detective, for our listening audience, that we've had 732 homicides in this city so far in 2020. And many of those homicides have involved young people as the victim. What's it like for a homicide detective to show up on a scene and a really young person is the victim, and now you have to notify parents, interview witness, and keep your composure in this traumatic circumstance?
It's extremely difficult. As you can imagine, majority of the detectives are parents themselves, or at least they have nieces and nephews, and are just dealing with children. So anytime you're dealing with a child murder, it's an extremely difficult scene, and the detectives have a job to do, right? The detectives need to keep their composure, and they need to stay focused on their job, but they are human, right? They're not robots. Sometimes I feel like maybe certain members of the community think that police officers are robotic and they can just go about their daily job without any emotional feelings. And the fact of the matter is, when you see a child who's been murdered on the street, through gunshot wounds or through other means, we've had several children murdered this year between the ages of 0 to 14, and detectives, they have to respond to those scenes. Our evidence technicians have to process those scenes, and then they do have to go home to their families and try to, be a regular parent while they're sitting there and having dinner, maybe with their 9-year-old child, when they know another family had just lost their 9-year-old child, and they had to deal with those parents and try to comfort them, as well as stay focused and try to solve their case. But it's very difficult because there's the detectives, as I mentioned, they obviously have emotions, but then they're trying to stay laser focused on clearing the case and trying to bring a little bit of justice for these families if they can arrest the offender and charge them.
So I've tried to really focus on officer wellness, and sometimes we think about the homicide detective and saying, this is just what you do. There's not an officer wellness issue, when in fact, there's a significant officer wellness issue when you're in jobs like homicide detectives, on top of just the everyday police officer work. But if you're just responding to homicides, what are some things as a law enforcement professional, you suggest we all consider when it comes to officer wellness for homicide detectives?
They need officer wellness probably more than most, I would argue.
I would say the same.
Yeah, I don't think people truly understand the toll it takes just on their physical bodies as well. So mentally and physically, these guys work around the clock consistently. They're in court all day. They'll come in that night. They'll get another murder. They'll work all around the clock again. So on top of seeing the dead bodies every day and how that's affecting them mentally, there's also a physical aspect to it, for their bodies. So mentally and physically, I think the homicide detectives probably need, some sort of outlet and some sort of wellness to address this, and they have to realize the science of it and how it's affecting their minds and bodies, and make sure that when they are fortunate enough to be in retirement, that they're able to enjoy it. And so I think it is it's a very important aspect. And as you mentioned, people just kind of expect it of homicide detectives, but there's a life after this that they should be able to enjoy after seeing what they see for possibly 25 years.
So far in 2020, we've solved over 320 or so. What does solving a criminal on criminal homicide versus stranger on stranger homicide look like in Chicago? What's the difficulties and challenges of solving homicides in Chicago, particularly when it involves criminal on criminal?
Sure, I would say that the criminal on criminal homicides are the most difficult ones to solve.
Why?
Several different reasons. Majority is, I think if you read every study on homicides, they usually end with, they give you all kinds of suggestions, but they usually end with the most difficult cases to solve are cases that have an outdoor scene, committed with a handgun, and criminal on criminal. To answer your question on why, it's because the criminal groups obviously do not cooperate with the police. Right. So the criminal groups, and we have to remember, this is an extremely small percentage of the community. The majority of the community is getting up and going to work every day. They don't want this occurring in their community either. But the fact of the matter is, we do have these small groups that constantly will be shooting at each other back and forth for, possibly for years, or whatever the gang feud or criminal feud may be. And then finally, when there's a murder, the detectives are supposed to go out there, and now they're seeking witness cooperation. So normally, obviously, the victim is deceased, but the people who are with the victim are part of that criminal element. They don't cooperate with the police. And as a matter of fact, they try to point the detectives in the wrong direction or push them away, which obviously, even to just a regular citizen, well, obviously the case is going to be very hard to solve.
So let's start right there. So often we would see criminal on criminal having some misdirection when you do talk to witnesses who are criminals, pointing you in the opposite direction of that you should be going in and solve the crime. Is that because I want to take care of it myself? I don't want police involved?
That's exactly it.
Right.
So that's why it's an ongoing criminal to criminal feud.
So this leads me to how technology has really enhanced our ability to solve crimes, especially those types of crimes, homicides, that involve criminal on criminal who are not cooperating, and maybe even sending us in the wrong direction because they want to handle it themselves. What does technology do to overcome that dynamic?
So I think one of the greatest things that the police department has done in the past few years is they've created these area technology centers in every detective division, and they've given us technology tools to use all the technology that's out there on the street, all the different video, all the different pod cameras, and without going into too much depth, we have the tools and the resources we need in order to solve those crimes. So for example, like you said, if the witnesses aren't cooperating at this point with society, many times the detectives are able to get a video of the vehicle that may have fled the scene. If we're fortunate enough to get a video of that and keep tracking that video, maybe we can get a license plate. And if we get the license plate, maybe it doesn't actually show the offender on the scene. Maybe he'd be covered when he was doing the shooting incident, but there's plenty of times where possibly a half hour before the shooting incident, that same individual is wearing a very identifiable jacket. He may have gone into a gas station. And now we have video. Even without the witnesses, we work extremely closely with our state's attorney's office. Obviously, these cases are very difficult to pursue in court as well. But the video, the technology, that's what pushes these cases over the edge. But I will have to say, these detectives grind out this work. It doesn't this doesn't happen in a day.
Right.
It's not a TV show.
Right.
It's very
It's not
difficult.
first 48 where you got within 48 hours it's solved.
That is correct. It's not the first 48. It's just these detectives grind out this work. It's a lot of search warrants. It's a lot of work with social media. It's a lot of work with video. It's a lot of work with phones. And it's all very taxing and very tedious. It's not very easy. So I give credit to the detectives who, stay within their lane, and they just, like I said, they kind of grind these things out in order to solve these cases. I think it's extremely important to understand that all these victims are truly victims, and loss of life is it's a very difficult thing to deal with for these families.
Regardless whether it's criminal on criminal or not.
Regardless. So a lot of times when people see that and they say, oh, well, this guy's been arrested 24 times, and maybe some members of the community might not feel that that life is as valued as maybe somebody else's, and that's just not true. And as you mentioned earlier, with the detectives who have to go and talk to families who may have lost a 9-year-old or a 5-year-old, it doesn't matter. You still have to go talk to that person's mother, and that was their son. That was their child that they loved, and they're grasping, holding a picture of them when they graduated from kindergarten, and that's their child who they love so much. And whether they chose to go down a different life path, it's still this remarkable ripple effect for that family who lost that loved one. And regardless of what, like I said, maybe some criminal history, they still were a son, they still were an aunt or uncle, and it really antagonizes and it really disrupts that specific family. And the ripple effect from there goes on and on. It doesn't just touch one person.
So we have been really pushing forth an effort to engage the community. And when we were talking about this, you gave a great example of your detectives already in this space of engaging the community, where one of your detective sergeants, I believe, were at the jail, and they saw where some of these people who we have arrested for various types of crimes really were trying to seek a way out of a life of crime. Can you talk a little bit about the community engagement of your detectives and that example specifically?
So all of the detective division is doing more community engagement, and there's many different examples that they're doing, because what they want to do is the detectives want to get to know the community before they show up on that scene of the murder, so that people from the community are familiar with that specific detective, whether they were at an event for baseball or some sort of sporting or whatever community engagement project. They want to be able to recognize that detective as someone who's part of the community. Specifically though, and this was a great example of a sergeant who was just being extremely proactive. He worked in the jail, and what he was trying to do is obviously work and clear homicide cases through the jail by gathering intelligence information. And what he found out was he was talking to several individuals who were definitely willing to help the police, but more importantly, they really wanted to start a different life when they got out of jail. And then he pretty much took this on his own. The sergeant was extremely proactive, and he started a system. Basically what he's trying to do is ensure that these individuals get jobs when they get out of jail. And he's even reached out to companies on his own. I know for a fact that he found one individual a job just basically on his own. He just took it upon himself to find him a job. And I think that just goes a long way to show this specific sergeant has just a passion for this, but it's because there was a need. These guys, like I said, they definitely could give him some of the information that he needed, but these guys were very sincere that they wanted a different lifestyle, and they were asking him for help. And instead of him pointing them in a different direction, he took it upon himself, and he's made this project, and he's definitely connecting with more and more sources to help these individuals out.
Yeah, that example there and many others, I'm sure, are the examples of what policing has to become going forward from 2020 into next year, is more of a resource for people, as well as having to do the job we have to do when we investigate crime, but also being sensitive to the community needs.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. Thank you.